Hi, everyone. This is Talk Back. You know, it's May 2021, but let's go back 45 years. We're celebrating the anniversary of a local institution that has made a difference in the lives of so many people, families, women, men, and children. What was happening in the 1970s? We've got some guests who were founders of a wonderful institution, the Women's Center of Southeastern Connecticut, which was founded in 1976, and we're celebrating a 45th anniversary, now constituted as Safe Futures of Southeastern Connecticut, and it has expanded and done so much in all this time. But what was going on in the minds of these women who decided they needed to get together to form an association that would bring support and help and enlightenment to so many women, especially in the beginning? Think back, if you know your history at all, and you're as old as we are, you remember that 1963, Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, and it revolutionized women's thoughts about the workplace and their role in society. In 1966, the National Organization for Women Now was formed. In 1971, Ms. Magazine came out, Gloria Steinem, and that was a sensation. And then in the 1970s, we started to change our laws about rape. Did you know that until the 1970s, all of the laws, the criminal laws on rape, had exceptions when the rape happened to be between a married couple? His husband could not be criminally charged for, quote, raping his wife. So all of these things were building up in the 1970s, and a group of women with foresight, intelligence, skills in psychology, in science, in business, in all areas of life got together to create the Women's Center of Southeastern Connecticut. So now let me introduce some of the original founders of that movement. Barbara Greenberg was the president when it originally started. Hi, Barbara. How are you?
Hey, Sheila.
And you're talking to us now from where? Are you in Connecticut?
I'm actually in New York City, where I live.
In New York City. Lois Andrews, the local attorney in New London for many years, was originally the secretary of the Women's Center. Hi, Lois. How are you?
Hi.
And you've pretty much stayed home base in New London all of these years, right?
Yep. Our office is actually in Waterford, but that's pretty close.
Well, you know, in New London County area, of course. And then we have Nadine Lippman, also, who's living in this area. And Nadine started out as the treasurer of the beginning organization, right?
Yes, I did for a short time until I realized that the tax laws were way above my head.
Okay. And then Martha Laurie. Martha, you were one of the founding mothers, as we call it, of the Women's Center. Is that right?
That is correct. Obviously, I didn't stick with it long term, but the original objective was to get an organization going that would outlive all of us. And I'm so thrilled that was achieved.
Right. And now the organization that we call Safe Futures today is the direct descendant, the exact organization you all began. So based on my introduction, Barbara, why don't you tell us what was germinating up in your minds and your friends' minds when you said, you know what, we've got to put a notice in the paper. We've got to get a group of women together. Women are organizing all over the state, all over the country to make a difference in our lives, to support one another in our new ventures. Talk about that, Barbara.
Sure. There was an article placed in the New London Day inviting women to come together and meet. We met in the basement of UConn Avery Point, I believe, the first time. And I believe Leslie Pope actually placed that ad, or that wasn't an ad, it was a short article. My friend Pat Christie, who was also a founding mother of the Women's Center, told me about it. She was very interested in counseling, career counseling. And she suggested I come along with her. At the time, I was working for Electric Boat Division in what would be now called Human Resources. It was then Compensation and Management Relations. And so we went off to the meeting one evening together, and there we met 8 or 10 women who were very interested in working together to found a place for women that would address women's issues, which we felt really weren't being handled. We weren't clear about what we were going to do at first, but in talking about it and in learning from Leslie about her work at the Rape Crisis Center at University of Connecticut, we began working first on that. And we opened an office in the basement of UConn, Avery Point in Groton, where we gathered on a couple of nights a week, and we chipped in to install a telephone, $10 each. We had absolutely no money, but lots of great ideas about how we might go forward for all women, women who are widowed or divorced or separated or who lost newborn babies or survivors of rape and incest or battering.
Right. So Lois, let me turn to you now. You've talked about the fact that when it started out, rape crisis counseling was one of the founding features and important issues that you talked about. But tell us about how you began to realize that many women were calling about domestic violence issues and being battered and abused. It's an issue that, of course, we're still dealing with today. Lois?
Hi. Yeah, I mean, our first project was to set up a rape crisis hotline. And once we got that going and we started receiving phone calls on the hotline, we realized that a lot of the phone calls were from women who were battered rather than raped. So it was it's kind of a wake-up call to at least most of us. At that time, I mean, we were young and innocent, and the whole battering problem had been swept under the rug for so long that at least I was completely unaware of it, and I think that's probably true of most of us. Mm-hmm. We certainly had no idea as to the extent of the problem. And so as we started getting those phone calls, we realized what a problem it was. And then we moved forward to establish a hotline for battered women and other services for them as well. So, yeah.
Nadine, what was your interest? What were the issues that were important to you during that time that made you become part of the Women's Center when it got started?
I initially started out as as a representative from Planned Parenthood League of Connecticut in New London. And when I actually joined with the group, I realized this was much more than something I needed to be involved with because of PPLC. I needed to be involved with because of my own beliefs. I had a roommate in college who had been raped at one point, and we were together for one semester. She was just so, she was probably suffering from PTSD, or post-traumatic stress syndrome. And, that stayed in the back of my mind. Then as we started meeting and I found out about all the things the Women's Center planned to do, not just stay in one section with just the rape crisis, that appealed to me. I remember when that first issue of Ms. came out and it was being passed around the dorm when I was at UConn. And it really did make an impression on me. I continued attending the meetings, and I became the treasurer, not anticipating how much I would need to know about the tax laws. We were very fortunate because we had Sandy Dietrich, who I believe Barbara knew from outside the organization, who ended up taking over when we needed to start filling out forms to make us a tax exempt organization. But, who would have envisioned that the Women's Center that we started 45 years ago would actually evolve into the organization it has?
Right. And now let's turn to Martha. Martha, so many of the other women had careers in psychology, in human resources, and those type of issues. You were in the science field, as was one of the other founders who's now gone, and we'll talk about her and the others who are no longer with us. Tell us about how life in the 70s was like for you as a woman, and what made it important for you to join this Women's Center and become one of the founding mothers.
I had a background working with NOW. I was the became the president of the NOW chapter in Mystic. My personal background was that although I had a bachelor's degree in chemistry and I had gone to graduate school at Princeton in history, and I had worked as a technician in Germany in a lab. When I came to Connecticut, where my late husband, Mike Hendrick, was a scientist at Pfizer, they were very reluctant to hire women in if they were married to one of the scientists who was already there. And that, of course, changed enormously over the years, which is a good thing. But I was very much at loose ends. I'd also picked up a master's in education at Stanford, which didn't help at all getting a teaching job in Connecticut. So personally, I was very much at loose ends with my career unknown, my career path unknown. But I did know that when I saw the article in the paper, already having connections with many women in the area, that it was something that I should get involved with. My original intent was to focus on career development for women, but it became very clear, I think largely through the efforts of Leslie Pope, that there were some really critical issues that needed to be addressed in the area, and that is the rape crisis to start with. So that was what brought me in, and I'd like to say that my dear friend Lois got pulled in from two directions, I think, from me calling her and from Barbara Greenberg. But I would add that it was the Women's Center that is the reason that I had a career. The late Dr. Delisle Eastwood, who was also one of the original members, announced that there was a job opening at the Coast Guard Research and Development Center for a technician. I fit the requirements perfectly, and I did take that position. And as they say, the rest is history. I ended up with a PhD in analytical chemistry and a career which ended as the manager of the Coast Guard's laboratory for oil spill identification. So when I went to graduate school, I didn't have the time or energy going up to stores and also working half time for the Coast Guard to continue with the Women's Center. But since the original impetus was to have an organization which didn't depend on any one person, I was thrilled that it continued. I knew it didn't depend on me, although I think maybe Barbara Greenberg gets most of the credit for getting it on that footing. So thank you.
So I want to go back to some of the other founders that are no longer here with us. And Martha, you just mentioned Dr. Delisle Eastwood, who was I think you considered her your mentor. She helped you in your career,
Mhm.
and she was one of the founding mothers who we've lost in the last few years. Barbara, can you tell us a little bit about the other founding members we've lost? First of all, there were 9 listed here. I'm going to read them off. Who's still here? Lois Andrews, Barbara Greenberg, Dr. Martha Laurie, Nadine Coleman, now Lippman, and Leslie Pope Hall. Those we lost besides Dr. Eastwood are Patricia Christie, Nancy D. Marinas, and Jane Torrey. So Barbara, can you speak to them, just a few words about each one that we can remember and honor their memory and the efforts that they gave as founding mothers of the Women's Center?
Sure. So Pat Christie was a dear friend. She went to Connecticut College, where she met Jane Torrey, who also is no longer with us. And Pat was the person who pulled me into that first meeting at the Women's Center. She was a founding member of the board of directors, and she was very supportive to me when I was the first president of the board of directors and then the first executive director of the Women's Center. She was a very generous, kind person who grew up in Connecticut and who was a strong contributor in every way to the work of the Women's Center. She later moved to California to be near her son, Joe, and that's where she passed away a few years back. Nancy D. Marinas. Nancy lived in Groton, and many of you may know her because she was state representative for many years. She was also a teacher and a guidance advisor in the Groton school system, and she had a private practice for a while as well. She had her master's in, I believe it was in counseling. And she was a fabulous supporter of the Women's Center in every way. When we first started meeting in the basement at University of Connecticut Avery Point, Nancy stepped forward and said that she would organize all of the evening hours of the Women's Center and coordinate a volunteer force who would be there every evening that it was open. And she was first vice president of the Women's Center and on the board for many years. And Jane Torrey, a professor at Connecticut College. She was, I think, very influential in many women's lives in southeastern Connecticut. She was a professor of psychology. I'm not sure exactly which kind of psychology, but was very active in the community and well known at Connecticut College. And also, of course, a founding mother of the Women's Center. I miss all 4 of them very much. Pat and Nancy were dear friends until their deaths recently. So I certainly miss them.
Okay.
And maybe others can say more about them as well.
I know. And do any of the others like to mention anything in tribute to those 4 that we're talking about? Patricia Christie, Nancy D. Marinas, Delisle Eastwood, and Jane Torrey. Lois, do you have anything to say in honor of those people?
I can't really add to what Barbara already said. They were all wonderful women. And I probably knew Nancy the best of them. And they'll all be missed.
So Lois, as the attorney in the group, let's talk about just organizing. It's one thing to meet in the basement at Avery Point of UConn and Groton. It's another to actually put together an organization in a business and legal way. Tell us about how that happened, how you did that, how you got a charter, and all of the work that went into actually creating an organization that had a legal foundation.
Well, that was probably my biggest contribution to the Women's Center. Yeah, we decided there was some talk about just leaving it as a loose association, and we decided it made more sense to actually have it formalized. And so I helped to get it incorporated. And then once it was incorporated, we went about getting our tax exempt status, 501(c) status, which was a real learning experience for me. I had no idea what I was doing. But we did get it done, so that's a plus. So yeah, it took a lot of work to get the 501(c), but it's there now, and that's really great. So yeah.
So Nadine, as the beginning treasurer, and you said that you got started in doing this, but then of course you felt it was over your head and you needed more professional help. Tell us about the early struggles with the finances. Where did the money come from to initiate some of these programs? Was everybody a volunteer?
As Barbara alluded to it before, when we first started, we all donated $10 to be able to get a phone. We were promised interest on our $10. I'm still waiting. That's really one of my favorite stories, because we really had no money. And so there really wasn't that much for me to do except keep track of that $10 that paid out for the phone. And as I said, I didn't last in that position too long because we didn't have money. And the only thing we really needed to do at that point was to figure out the taxes. And along with what Lois was doing, I just sat there and kept my mouth shut most of the time. I did take the first rape crisis counseling course that Leslie offered. In fact, all the staff from Planned Parenthood attended it. And I don't remember if we charged for that or not. I don't think so, because everyone was volunteers. And we met at the YWCA, which was located that time on Broad Street. But we really had absolutely no money, so everyone was a volunteer, as Barbara said. We just, we really had, and it wasn't until we started charging membership that things started to change a teensy bit.
Okay. Martha, do you remember the original, some of the meetings? We read some of the old newspaper articles that said at one meeting there were about 30 women that were present. Do you remember some of the early meetings and about how many women from the community came to join you?
I think we had a very good response to that article that was in the day. And I remember the meeting. I really think the first meeting might have been upstairs at the Branford House. Everybody says Avery Point, the basement. Well, the Branford House was the mansion that was built right on the point there at Avery Point, and it was part of the University of Connecticut's Avery Point campus. And the basement was actually, we moved to the basement very quickly if we didn't start there. But I do remember that if it was a Wednesday night, the bagpipers played.
Right.
on the campus there. They had a bagpipe group that got together. And in fact, I lived around the corner on Jupiter Point, and we could always hear the bagpipers on Wednesday nights from Jupiter Point. So you can only remember what it must have sounded like to think that we were down in the basement and they were just right outside. So that was a memory I think all of us share. The basement, I think, was pretty musty as well. And it was not the ideal location, but it was free at that point, I think. So that's the way it was.
All right. So Barbara, as the first president and then as the first executive director, tell us about the growing pains and how you worked things through and moved locations and made progress. And initially I read that the hotline for the rape crisis was only available a couple of nights a week. How did those things kind of expand? And business-wise, how did you get more than the $10 from every member for the hotline?
Right. Well, we worked very hard to bring in funding. And in fact, I didn't become executive director until our first significant grant was received from the state of Connecticut. And we also received some United Way funding to help launch us. And then a number of foundations. Millie Devine was at, I don't remember what the bank was called then. I think it's changed names several times, but she was at a local bank and she made grants to nonprofit organizations in the community. And we were able to get a number of those grants over the years from that bank and from Millie, from a trust that she administered, I think. And then other local foundations and funding entities would give us money. Women's organizations, Lions, Rotary, Seroptimists, and other organizations like that would give us money. Sometimes people from corporations would donate things and donate funds as well. We really were very actively fundraising, and I wrote an extraordinary number of proposals, and that's how we got it going. Our first grant from the state enabled us to hire 3 staff. That was Linda Vogel, who was our director of counseling, and Marty I, who was also a counselor, and I as executive director. And by the time I left, which was in, I think around 84 or 85 maybe, we had 14 or 15 staff and over 100 volunteers, and we're well on our way, I think, to being an organization even more capable of reaching out to women all over New London County.
Right. And when did you change locations? Tell us about that. And how did you acquire different places?
Yeah, we moved to the Martin Center in New London. And that was a fabulous move because we had one individual office and one room that we turned into a living room. And then later we were able to add a second individual room. We grew very, very quickly, serving thousands and thousands of women every year. And we also, moved into any space that we could find. There was another large room adjacent to the room we were in, and we were able to rent that after a while. And then we rented the backstage in the auditorium, which we turned into the executive offices, where we did training and board meetings. I was there, and Katrina Henry, my assistant, was there as well. She now lives in Stonington, I believe. And we were doing counseling in the auditorium when there was no individual space left anywhere else. We would just go in, sit in the auditorium with a woman and her children, or wherever we could find a private space. We were very fortunate to be in the Martin Center because it was a comprehensive services location. And just down the hall was the Department of Social Services, and Norma Albright, who was its director, and she was extraordinarily helpful, working with women to help them get financial assistance and other kinds of assistance that they needed to become independent after living in the shelter or while living in the shelter. So and then we opened an office in Norwich as well, at Mohegan. And of course, we opened Genesis House, the shelter for battered women and their children. And I'm not sure what year Genesis House opened, but we were offered a property with the help of SCAD. SCAD was a Southeastern Council on Alcohol and Drug Dependence, and of course they had many residential locations. And one of them they were no longer going to use. They asked us if we would like to take over the lease, and we were able to do that and open Genesis House. And we named it by asking everybody, all of the women, everyone who was involved in the Women's Center in any way. We had a contest of sorts, not a contest, but we asked for ideas. And the one that received the most votes was Genesis House. And that's how the name came about.
Right. And the purpose of Genesis House was what?
a shelter for battered women and their children who had nowhere else to go and needed the safety of a living environment with supportive services from the staff at the Women's Center, and with the ability to have support groups and meet other women who were experiencing the same kinds of life.
Of course, to this day, the location of the Genesis House is not disclosed, so that the people, the women, children, sometimes even men now, who need that shelter are secure in their location, right?
Right. Yes,
Right.
and it was a huge concern, Sheila, because we had batterers who would come to our offices and demand to see their wives. And we had men who threw big, heavy chairs at us. And we had code words so that if there was someone in danger, we would know to get that person, the man, out of the center and lock the door. And I was often the lure to get the man out the door, and then they would lock the door behind me.
Right.
And fortunately, the police station was not far away, and they were very responsive. Chief Fendel was then the chief of police, and he was very helpful in helping us establish connections with the police, not only for the safety of the women and for us at the office, but also in other locations where we were working.
So let me turn to Lois now, because Lois, as a fellow attorney practicing in the 1970s, you and I know, and Barbara's expressing it, there was a revolution in the care of victims for domestic violence. It took a long time. The police, the medical community, the criminal justice system didn't always understand and take the issues seriously and know about them. But it was starting in the late 70s, right? And talk about how you set up a referral center. I was an attorney in the late 70s who got referrals for pro bono or free legal services for women who had come to the center who desperately needed legal help, as well as shelter, as well as counseling. Talk about the beginnings of that movement.
Actually, Sheila, I think I might throw that one back to you. I do estate planning, and you were handling family law, and you did a lot more to help those women than I did on that. It just wasn't my area of practice. So I think you're more familiar with that whole system than I was. So thank you for your contribution.
But of course, you helped set up the referral system, and the fact that the Women's Center was there to help women in desperate need. And you were able to turn to those of us in the legal community who had, well, I can't say expertise. It was a learning curve for all of us in the 70s and 80s. And Connecticut was in the vanguard of the states that was starting to change its laws about how to handle issues of domestic violence as they arose. And it's been a struggle ever since. We're making more progress. And when we talk to Safe Futures today, they are trying to set up a family justice center, which will be a coordinated effort to bring all of the institutions that a person in need needs to avail herself or himself or the family of to handle these issues. But Lois, you did talk about how in the initial stages you realized the depth of the domestic violence issue by the calls that you were getting, which were just not all related to rape issues, right?
That's true. I mean, we really didn't have a clue as to the extent of the battering problem before we started getting those phone calls. And once we started getting it, we decided to try to expand into that area to help those women. And I know there was a course on the subject which I took, but I don't remember who gave the course, but it was great. I mean, in that it was well presented, and I think all of us learned a lot about how the whole domestic abuse thing works. You know, that it's not just physical violence, it's also emotional violence, always emotional violence. And sometimes it's just emotional violence, which is bad enough. But the physical violence was always accompanied by the emotional violence. And you hear people say, well, why don't they just leave? And it's not that simple, because the typical battered woman, I think, is cut off from society. Her batterer prevents her from seeing her friends, from seeing her family. Controls the money, doesn't allow her to have her own means, and then convinces her that this is normal, what he does, and that it's all her fault, and that she's just lucky to have him, because without him, she wouldn't be able to do anything. So it's the whole emotional battering thing, which is such an important element to the situation.
Right. And as you said, the Women's Center brought in trained counselors, and you took trainings to learn about the dynamics of domestic violence. And over the years, the police, the medical community, the criminal justice community changed their laws, their methods of operation, and now they are full cooperators with Safe Futures and the Women's Center of Southeastern Connecticut, as it's configured now, Safe Futures. Martha, I wanted to ask you, you said when you first started this venture, you were thinking it would be great for kind of career counseling and having a job workshop and things like that. But there was some efforts to do that and to help women counseling with their careers and their going back into the job market. Isn't that right, Martha?
Well, I don't know. Maybe Barbara can speak to that. I don't think there was anything organized formally separately from the battered women's shelter or the rape crisis counseling. There was also a very early effort. Some of us who were dealing with the issues of childcare were thinking in terms, and for a while, some of the women, we actually had a little childcare swap, a little pool where you could leave your child for a few hours, but that of course was very informal, and so it didn't persist. It wasn't a formal program. I don't know, Barbara, did you have any recollection of career counseling separately from the battered women's shelter?
Well, I read in some of the early newspaper articles that we've shared that there was going to be a job workshop and an information center. Barbara, did any of that materialize?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, we had a number of job skills training and career enhancement kinds of workshops, and some of our original founding members were very instrumental in making those happen. We also had financial planning, and I think maybe Lois may have participated in some of those. A woman named Pat Burton organized those, and they were very helpful to the women, everything from budgeting to planning finances for women. And another thing that we had that I think was extremely important to us in the early stages, Sheila, was we developed agreements with the hospitals, the local hospitals, both for battered women and for survivors of rape and incest, and with the police stations in each town, and of course with the courts. I mean, in each town, also, I hasten to add, when we were talking about funding, we had funding from a large number of the towns in New London County, and members of the board and other members of the center and people who are interested in the center's success would go to the town meetings every year to help us make a case for supporting the Women's Center based on the numbers of women we had been serving from their town. So they were also very supportive. We had a huge network of people who were really concerned about the success of the Women's Center.
Right, and you also eventually, of course, had a cadre of trained counselors who were on staff and paid. And how did that progress?
We had well, we started first with Linda Vogel and Marty I, and later on Barbara Scheckman and Donna Goldman, who started as the director of volunteers and then became a counselor as well. And when we had 10 or 15 staff toward the end of my leaving in the, I guess, somewhere between 83, 84, 85, somewhere in there, many of our staff members were master's level counselors, and some of them with bachelor's degrees who had training and were working on the hotlines and also working in the office in various capacities. So while I was executive director of the Women's Center, I had forgotten, I went to UConn and got my master's in social work in my spare time, which there wasn't much of.
So
But
is it fair to say for all of you that starting with this adventure, it was an empowerment for other women that you wanted to help, but you also had self-enlightenment, self-empowerment, self-actualization, and doing more for your careers and the things. I want to ask each of you about that, how it affected you in your personal lives and what was going on in the era when all this was happening, and how you feel progress has been made or what still needs to be done. Notwithstanding the great success of Safe Futures and all the work it's doing, we still have 1 in 4 women affected by harassment and domestic violence, 1 in 7 men, millions of children in this country, witnesses, bystanders, or even victims of abuse themselves. We still have a long way to go. So tell us, I'll start with you, Nadine, as a way to kind of summarize this. How did you feel belonging to this movement in the beginning empowered you, empowered others? And have we made the kind of progress that you hoped? What is the most surprising thing or the thing that you wish most would happen now?
Well, one of the most surprising things is that we now have a budget of multi-million dollars because, like I said, I was the original treasurer, and that we still exist. I mean, yes, you're right. There's still a long way to go. And I think part of it relates to women understanding that they're women and they can do everything. Sadly, there's still so many women who are not realizing their potential, their full potential. There's also the racial instance that needs to be further for women of color to realize that they can be part of this, and for us to understand that just because they may live in one area, it's not something that they can continue to put up with. At one point, I ran a volunteer program at Niantic Correctional Center, and one of the sad things that we learned were that women were more likely to be put in jail or prison because of the males that they associated themselves with, and that a lot of women, once they were released, went back into the same situation that they had left, that originally put them in. So that I'm really pleased to see that there is a justice angle that is being associated with the Women's Center or the Safe Futures now.
Okay, great. Martha, how about you? Have we made as much progress as you thought we might, or what's missing still, or how has it affected your life and those of the women around you?
Well, clearly, it was absolutely critical for my developing a career and accomplishing what I did. I did retire very early, and my second husband, who only passed away in November, was a Messianic rabbi and pastor. Okay, so I was a pastor's wife. And one of the big concerns that I have now, and I don't know to what extent it has been or could be addressed by the Women's Center, the very large number of young women who are having children out of wedlock. And I'm not talking, I don't have that much experience with the Black community, but I can tell you that it is a increasing problem in the white community. More and more children born to mothers who are then dependent on the government and have a man or different men floating in and out of their lives. It's just not a healthy situation. And that seems to be on the increase. I know 40% of the children born in this country right now are born out of wedlock. So that is going to be a huge issue, because without the stability of a family, the children are far more likely to have problems as well. And so, I mean, it's, what I have to say is not as upbeat as you would like. For professional women, for women who get an education, it's different now, very different, different prospects. But the real task is to get more women into this educational pathway where they can become independent and support themselves. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, and now Lois, let's get your thoughts on these questions.
Well, I would say that some things have definitely improved. When I went to law school, there was like 5% of my class was women. And now I think most law schools is more like 50%. And I think the same is true of medical school. So as Martha said, for those who can follow an education track, I think things have really improved. I mean, when I first started practicing law, I remember when I was in court in New London, and I was dressed in a skirted suit, and I was carrying my briefcase, and I was going in to see the judge in chambers, and the clerk said, "Well, you can't go in there; only attorneys can." And I got a lot of that. You probably did too, but I think it's way better in those aspects now. But there's still an awful lot to be done. I mean, the thing I mentioned earlier about people saying, well, why don't women just leave that situation? I think people still think that way. A lot of people still think that way. On the other hand, I think it's at least a more known problem than it used to be. And I think at least in some cultures, people are less inclined to blame the victim than they used to, but a lot of people are still blaming the victim. So there's a long way to go. I mean, the services are unfortunately still very needed.
Okay. And Barbara, we'll summarize with your comments. What have you?
One of the questions I thought you asked in that string of questions, Sheila, was how the Women's Center helped to build women's strength and go forward. Is that one that I can answer, or you would?
Sure.
Yeah, so I really would like to talk about that, because many of us built our strength and our experience and our knowledge at the Women's Center, and then went on to higher education and built up to other jobs. I remember one woman who joined us early on was a woman named Karen Nagel, who had no experience in statistics or any of that, but spent a lot of time working for us, learning how to gather all of the information that we needed for the various grants that we had received, which is very complicated business to count in the ways that we need to count, and to develop the forms that need to be developed that collected all the information. And she went on to become a CPA, because she enjoyed working with numbers so much. She had never done it before. And similarly, I went on to work for the Office of Policy and Management at the state with a process called negotiated investment strategy, where we had $40 million to allocate to cities and towns and state government and to nonprofits. And without my experience at the Women's Center with cities and towns and with nonprofits, I don't think I would have been a very good candidate for that job. And then from there, I went on to the Travelers Companies, where I was an officer and worked for the Travelers Companies Foundation, making grants in aging, and then into the city, New York City, as executive director of a foundation. And then they helped me to launch my own consulting business. So all of those experiences helped all of us build and move to the next place and feel stronger, I think, about our own abilities. And so I give the Women's Center a lot of credit for that. And I think, that one of our on our stationary Women's Center of Southeastern Connecticut, and then Women Together. We think that that's a really important takeaway from all of those years that we worked so hard to launch the Women's Center, that women of all ages, of all colors, of all income and sexual orientation and everything, we all worked together, and we met each other because we were at the Women's Center, and we had a passion for the work that we were doing. And many of us would probably not have met each other if we hadn't been there working together. So that also was an extraordinary experience, to see more of the world through all of our women colleagues within the Women's Center, volunteer and paid.
Right. And do you think that the current, what you know about what Safe Futures is doing now has exceeded your expectations of what could happen? Or do you still believe that our culture has a long way to go to make women as self-actualized as you were able to do through your work and your history?
I think we have a long way to go. Certainly women have many more opportunities available to them now than were available in the 70s. When I was growing up, there were three things that I could do, or I perceived that I could do. I could become a nurse, or a teacher, or a secretary. And I think that women today would be shocked to think that those might be their only options. So yeah, we've come a long way, but we also have a long way to go in order to build the confidence of women. Barbara Scheckman, who was at the center, our director of counseling for a time, taught assertiveness training for many years, and those were always totally full to capacity. And I think we still need assertiveness training for all of us. And we'll probably need it far into the future. I don't think the work of Safe Futures, or the Women's Center before it was called that, is done until we can somehow eliminate women who have had to survive rape and incest and battering, and children who have been battered. So we have a long way to go.
Well, it's been wonderful talking with you and celebrating the past, 1976, the founding of the Women's Center of Southeastern Connecticut, now succeeding in so many of its outreach programs in the community, setting up a family justice center, as Safe Futures. Thank you so much to Barbara, Lois, Martha, and Nadine. You all made a wonderful contribution. It's great to see you and to hear your thoughts. And we'll see you all next time on Talkback. Thank you and bye.
Thank you, Sheila.